All right, so we have two more policy labs left this afternoon, and we are going to be going through to 2 p.m. with this next one. The sponsor for this policy lab was the Metcalf Foundation, and we are looking at this policy lab at democratic institutions and civic engagement. And a wonderful team, Julia, Seth, Diana, and Nickson. Take it away. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. As Jennifer mentioned, my name is Seth Bumagat, and I'm joined by my wonderful team members, Julia Bruno, Diana Kamau, and Nickson Mugabi. We first want to extend a warm welcome to our jury members and as well to Mr. Jameson Steve from the Metcalf Foundation, who graciously sponsored our Policy Lab Challenge for today. Building on the land acknowledgements from yesterday, since our project takes place in British Columbia, which is home to over 200 Indigenous communities, we want to acknowledge that our work takes place on unceded territories. Any efforts which are taken to restore trust in our democratic institutions must recognize the colonial foundations of our political institutions. And our project today deals with systems of governance that we recognize are not representative of all peoples on Turtle Island. And while we recognize and are very excited to present this work with you all today, and we believe that it is vital, we also want to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have their own forms of governance. And as we reflect on those truths, it's important to remind ourselves that honesty is needed whenever we have conversations about rebuilding trust in our democratic institutions, and we need to acknowledge communities that have been historically underserved and voices which are still struggling to be heard today. And this very sentiment is reflected in our project, where there is a deep concern for the voices that lack recognition in important spaces like public policy. Because when those voices go unheard for far too long, trust in our democratic institutions can begin to erode. We've seen this in key inflection points in recent history, like the 2008 financial crisis and more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic and the January 6th attacks on the United States Capitol. It's clear that democracy is facing a challenge worldwide. But it's not just about low voter turnout rates, low engagement, or disillusionment with government. Rather, it's a growing crisis of trust. And this crisis is reflective of a widening disconnect between the public and the systems that are meant to serve us. So what's happening is not a slow drift, and it's being reflected as well in Canada, not just abroad. Public polling has shown that Canadians are indeed losing trust in their government. In 2021, from the Edelman Trust Barometer, 59% of Canadians trusted their government, and it is now down to 49% in 2024. That is a 10 percentage point decrease in a matter of a few years. More and more Canadians and citizens across the world are losing trust that the systems that are meant to serve them can no longer do so. What we're seeing, this phenomena, is a widening fissure, a fissure that is threatening the very foundations of our democratic society. It's affecting participation, the legitimacy of our institutions, and our own sense of collective responsibility. And amongst the backdrop of all of this, the Metcalf Foundation faced us with the question of how can Canadian democratic institutions strengthen trust and civic engagement with their citizens. With such a broad, massive scope, in fact, it's a joke amongst us that we're trying to save democracy. With such a broad, massive scope, we decided to focus in on the issue of youth engagement. For the purposes of our project, we're defining youth to be those aged 15 to 30 and everyone else to be youth adjacent. And to ground our project in a specific location, we decided to develop a policy package for the government of British Columbia, unknowingly knowing that former Premier Christy Clark will be here today. So it goes. But we did so because British Columbia is home to Vancouver, which is one of Canada's major metropolitan cities, and doing so allowed us to have a unique case study where there's a diverse demographic and as well an active civil society sector.
When looking at how to increase trust and civic engagement, we first need to start with how are we defining trust? The literature on trust offers us a variety of possible definitions, ranging from the trust that individuals have in their institutions, towards their elected officials, towards their immediate community, and as well as society at large. And what this research shows is that ultimately, trust is a feeling. It is a personal assessment that is based on our experiences and can differ greatly between individuals. Despite this, there do, however, exist various measurements that attempt to ascertain what levels of trust individuals have towards their government and democratic systems. In our research, we consulted the Edelman Trust Barometer, the Environics Trust and Readiness Barometer, information from Statistics and Elections Canada, as well as from other Canadian academic institutions such as the University of Waterloo. And across the board, all of these measurements use different definitions of trust and different metrics to get their numbers. And what this shows is that really trust is very hard to quantify and it is extremely complex. And this leaves us with the question, how can policymakers design policy that ultimately targets a feeling? But policymakers should be concerned about trust because what it offers to our democratic systems is a sense of integrity, continuity, and legitimacy. Compared to any other age cohort, youth exhibit the lowest levels of trust across Western liberal democracies. Since 2015, the Cambridge Centre for the Future of Democracy has been tracking an uptick in support for authoritarian regime types among youth. In Canada, Elections Canada has determined that youth have experienced the largest decreases in satisfactions with democracy between 2015 and 2021. During this time, Gen Z has experienced a 6 percentage point decrease, whereas millennials have experienced an 8 percentage point decrease. This widening generational divide should signal alarm bells to politicians and policymakers, as political research indicates that youth tend to signal the future directions of our political systems.
If trust is this ambiguous, amorphous, complex concept, then there needs to be a way, but incredibly important for democracy, then there needs to be a way for us to address it with policy. After delving deep into the democratic theory, we found that trust and civic engagement are mutually reinforcing. What this means is that improving civic engagement can help strengthen trust. This is great because civic engagement is an action. It is a better variable to actually affect with policy action because it is easier to define, measure, and quantify. For our purposes, we define civic engagement as conscious individual and group actions aimed at making a difference in community or civic life. This includes formal participation, so things like voting, and what we call informal engagement. These are things like volunteering at a charity or taking part in a walkout. So, for youth, what this means is we can address youth trust in government by improving youth civic engagement. Now, this sounds fairly simple, but it's a little bit more complicated than first meets the eye. And this is because you may have heard that youth are disengaged or apathetic. And this is a dominant narrative that exists because youth are participating less in formal participation methods like voting. As you can see, in 2021, only because the data on the current election has not yet come out, there was a youth voter turnout of only 47%, which was way lower than other age demographics, which were like around 75%. But here's where it gets a little bit more complicated and nuanced. Can I get a show of hands? How many people in this room have signed an online petition in the last 2 years? What about express their views online about politics or policy? That's what I thought. Okay, well, from our very scientific public survey that we just did, you would have seen that the young folks in the room were highly represented when it came to signing an online petition, and as well represented in expressing their views online. A little bit more than the less young folks. And this actually matches what we found in the data. According to Statistics Canada, youth are 48% more likely than any other age group to have signed an internet petition in the last 12 months, 37% more likely to have boycotted a product or a brand based on ethical reasons, 24% more likely to have expressed their views online, and 14% more likely to have participated in a demonstration. Now, I don't think this is a generation that is disengaged or apathetic. In fact, what our research found, and after talking to multiple interest holders, we found that there isn't an issue of interest. Youth are interested in policy and politics. The issue is there's a disconnect between government and youth. Government does not recognize, value, or regularly action the ways in which youth are currently engaging. In addition to this, youth often face systemic and structural barriers when they do try to engage. This looks like town hall meetings being placed at times where they're in school or working, or just simply not being taken seriously by government officials. In other words, ageism. And so if we want to address youth civic engagement, we have to address these key barriers, which is why we created a policy framework, which we affectionately call the bow tie, that outlines how barriers to youth civic engagement can be used to address the intractable issues around trust.
So looking at the trust side of this framework, what we see are the consequences stemming from a lack of trust. Starting with polarization, this refers to the widening ideological divide between individuals that makes it challenging to reconcile to find middle ground. This contributes to deteriorating social cohesion, wherein individuals have a reduced capacity to mobilize for collective action. Disillusionment refers to the feeling that even when I do engage, my input is not valued, nor is it reflected in the final outcome. This leads to decline in formal participation, as when individuals are discouraged from engaging with institutions that are ultimately not designed to serve them. Overall, this leads to ineffective institutions as they lack the representation of a key demographic, in our case youth, that make it harder for policymakers to build evidence-informed policy to address the needs and concerns of this demographic.
And moving on to the other side of the framework, we have civic engagement. Through our research and discussions with interest holders, we identified 10 key barriers that hinder youth from civically engaging. These are things that range from socioeconomic and status and class to precarious funding for civil society. In fact, 2 of the major barriers we identified was an underdeveloped relationship between the government and youth, and the other was the deprioritization of youth civic engagement. As we've heard, many youth today feel unseen and unheard by their government, which leads to feelings of disillusionment. And frankly, this is reflected with governments and politicians typically engaging the most with youth and their electorate the most during election periods. However, our research has shown that the contrary needs to happen, and it's imperative for governments and politicians to engage with the electorate and youth during non-election periods, because that's when people don't typically think about engaging with their politicians or going to town halls or voting. In other words, politicians and the government need to think about civic engagement beyond the voting booth.
So to recap, we recognize that there has been a growing decline of trust in government, and this has been partly because trust is such a wicked concept to resolve. So what we did is that we recognize that trust and civic engagement being mutually reinforcing, a set of action on the barriers to civic engagement has a mutual and ripple effect to the set of consequences that arise from lack of trust. So we went ahead and broke down or grouped the barriers to civic engagement into 3 main policy areas, that is governance, civic education, and youth empowerment. In doing this, we also appreciated that socio-economic barriers have a pertinent place in building public trust, but could not be included in our project because they were outside the scope of our project, and besides, they would need a broader economic policy that would address a number of structural issues to which civic engagement would be part of. So we recommend a comprehensive policy package, which we'll refer to as Y Engage, that is focused on reshifting and reinventing the entire ecosystem of youth civic engagement. It is hinged on 3 main policy areas. That is Y Focus in relation corresponding to governance, Y Learn in relation corresponding to civic education, Y Lead in relation and corresponding to youth empowerment. A combined application of all these policy pillars has an overall impact in preparing a youth population that is engaged, informed, and empowered.
In developing Y Engage, we first consulted several different policy options. As our question was, how can democratic institutions increase civic engagement and trust? The first option we looked at was reforming existing systems and processes for youth engagement. In other words, focusing on government and governance. What this would have looked like is looking at the current civic engagement opportunities for youth in BC and then suggesting policy to improve them. However, we rejected this option because after talking to key interest holders, as well as doing more research, we found that youth engagement really needed to have a wide scope in order to have effective policy. What this means, it had to affect multiple areas and have multiple key actors, including civil society organizations. Most importantly, any policy to improve youth civic engagement needed to think about youth and the way they're actually engaging. So it couldn't just focus on governance. So that brought us to our next option, which was to focus on a single issue area. This could have looked like addressing one of those 10 barriers we showed you. For example, just focusing on getting government to actually recognize the way and the informal ways that youth are engaging. But we decided against this because focusing on a single issue area assumes that one focus area could have a transformative enough impact on the entire youth civic engagement ecosystem, which after talking to interest holders, we found was quite unrealistic and infeasible, which is why we landed on our comprehensive policy package, which we refer to as Why Engage, because it provides a holistic way of addressing the different focus areas that are embedded in the youth civic engagement ecosystem and will allow us to achieve systematic change.
Pillar number 1 is Why Focus, which aims to prioritize and promote youth participation in governance. It does this through 3 program areas. The first is a youth web portal, which functions as a vital communication tool between government and youth. During our research, we found that youth-specific information in British Columbia was distributed across various government websites. In compiling all relevant information on funding and engagement opportunities, as well as other youth-specific information, youth are able to access these information in a timely and streamlined manner. The second program is Youth-Centered Design Grants, which offers capacity building for municipal governments to engage youth. In our research, we learned that it was vital municipal governments be a part of this project as they offer youth pathways to forming personal connections with elected officials and understanding their governance systems in their communities at a deeper level. Finally, the third program is the Youth Assemblies, which offer youth age 18 to 30 the opportunity to design recommendations for the provincial government around a substantive policy issue. Key to the legitimacy of this initiative is that it must be accompanied by a meaningful response from the government. This could include a report, an acknowledgement, or even plans for implementation. This was modeled off the Youth Assembly for Digital Rights and Safety, hosted by the McGill Center for Media, Technology and Democracy and Mass LBP. During this time, 35 youth from across Canada gathered to design recommendations targeting digital rights and safety that were ultimately reflected in the Online Harms Bill. Overall, Why Focus will increase institutional capacity for youth engagement, and in doing so, will embed youth priorities, perspectives, and experiences in the policy development process from the outset. Finally, this will extend democratic participation beyond election cycles as youth are offered meaningful ways to engage with 2 levels of government outside of simply voting.
Pillar 2 is Why Learn, which aims to reimagine civic education by progressing from knowledge to action. In Canada, the only province with a mandatory civics course is Ontario. In BC, everywhere else, civics is taught in various subjects such as English, life skills and careers, history, and social studies. In BC, social studies is mandatory until grade 10. In grade 10, students are allowed to meet the social studies requirement using three subjects, either First Nation studies, regular social studies, or civics. The civics course that is offered is a classroom-based course that's focused on teaching students about government structures, systems, and functions. So this is like learning about what the Senate does and like the different levels of jurisdiction and what the province versus the feds versus the municipalities. That's what they're learning. Now, although this information is pivotal in creating a foundational baseline civic education, we found in our research that it wasn't sufficient to actually cultivating long-term civic habits in students. This is because it doesn't actually equip students with the skills they need to actually go forward and engage in the future. Instead, hands-on experiential learning has been found to have a greater impact on students long-term, which is why YLearn proposes 4 main programs. The first is a voluntary extracurricular program in which students will be funded to actually design and implement civic engagement projects. These projects could be everything from climate organizing to a letter writing campaign to local officials. The point here is for democracy to be something that is done, learning through doing. The second program is a civics education course. Again, this is voluntary and extracurricular and will be part of a requirement if you're doing the civic engagement projects. This course aims to go beyond what is actually offered in the civics course currently, as it actually focuses on democratic engagement. How can students actually be part of their democratic processes? We want democracy to be something that students can see themselves in rather than something that is done to them. The third program is teachers training and resources. Teachers training will be provided to teachers to help them feel like they have the necessary skills to actually teach civic education effectively. This came from a key insight that we found, which is that it's not that teachers don't want to teach civics in classrooms, it's they feel that they don't have the necessary resources to be able to do so. So we will provide teacher training during existing professional development days so that teachers can actually help students implement their civic engagement projects. And the final program is a teachers network. This will be a virtual teachers network for teachers to connect with each other to facilitate horizontal learning and the sharing of best practices during this 4-year pilot program. This entire YLearn will be administered by a third-party organization, which will be identified through our RFP process. YLearn is also inspired by Action Civics, which is an educational model that comes out of the United States and has been tried in several different states in the US, and has been seen to have great success because it shifts the focus from actually learning about government to democratic engagement and organizing. And thus, YLearn the desired outcomes for YLearn are to develop students' civic knowledge and skills, provide relevant issue-focused experiential learning opportunities, as well as create an enabling environment with supportive adults for students to actually civically engage.
YLead as the third pillar of Y Engage policy package is a 4-year pilot program that is to be implemented by the government of British Columbia in collaboration with municipalities and civil society organizations. It seeks to empower youth through community involvement, and it shall achieve this through 3 different programs. The first program shall be Youth Hubs, which is creation of spaces for young people to engage boldly and safely. Under these hubs, we shall have 2 extra programs, which is program number 2, participatory budgeting. Participatory budgeting is a tool that shall be used to empower youth determine their budgeting priorities within these hubs, and the microgrant shall be used to fund the initiatives that youth come up as they engage in these different hubs. A combined implementation of the 3 programs seeks to achieve the desired outcomes of establishing dedicated spaces for youth to engage and express themselves boldly and safely, providing opportunities for learning and skills building, as well as cultivating civic habits amongst the engaging youth. This was inspired by 2 success stories, one from the city of Brampton, where we see youth engaging more broadly in matters that matter to them as youth through these hubs that have been created in the city of Brampton, but also in Brazil, where participatory budgeting was used to get youth determine the budgeting priorities of their local communities.
And now that we've talked about the 3 pillars of Y Engage and their associated programs, let's talk a little bit about the implementation plan. We propose that Y Engage be implemented as a pilot program over 4 years. In the first year, you'll see the plan and launch of some of the initiatives. So for example, for some of the youth assemblies, you can have civic lotteries to choose the participants. In the second year, all of the initiatives will be up and running. So for example, the youth hubs in the 5 different municipalities will be fully operational. And then in the third year, continuation of the programs will occur, and it'll be followed by formal program evaluations in year 4 to allow for the refinement and improvement of these initiatives beyond the pilot phase. Now, moving forward to the financial feasibility, Our budget estimates show that Y Engage is expected to cost about $12.1 million, but this cost is for the 4-year pilot. To put this into perspective, last year, in the 2024 British Columbia provincial election, major parties spent $15 million. To put it into other words, major parties spent $50 million to engage the electorate for a single day. Compare this to Y Engage, which seeks to engage youth and the electorate outside of election periods for a much longer time and for a little bit less of a cost. As well, the Ministry of Municipal Affairs currently allocates $140 million annually for the Community Gaming Grant. This grant provides funds for local nonprofits to help fund their initiatives such as civic engagement initiatives and extracurricular activities through these funds. So it's clear that democracy and rebuilding trust comes with a bit of a cost, $12 million of a cost. But arguably, the cost of inaction is far, far greater.
In closing, we hope to have demonstrated that rebuilding trust and re-enhancing civic engagement opportunities for youth is both urgent but possible. It is important that democratic societies are maintained as they are upheld by a public who is civically informed and supports key political values like civil rights. Combined, the proposed policy package builds an ecosystem where youth are engaged, informed, and empowered. It is crucial that governments be investing in youth engagement infrastructure, as this is a key safeguard against future democratic backsliding. While our recommendations were designed for the province of British Columbia, our research revealed that prioritizing youth engagement should be felt across the country. Further, these recommendations target youth, but we hope that they offer policymakers inspiration on how to better engage their public more broadly. And this is reflected in a sentiment shared with us by an interest holder who said that good youth engagement is just good civic engagement. Thank you. We look forward to your questions.
Look at that, right on time. Now, we have a slight juggling of the judges' chairs, given that we have someone who knows quite a lot about British Columbia in the room. So Brenda graciously gave up her chair. Which of you would like to go first? Which judge would like to go first? Do you want to start? We'll give Christy a minute first to think, and John, you can go first.
Okay, thanks. Good presentation. Good work. In my own experience, young people who were politically engaged got there by one of two routes. Either they came out to the demonstrations and protests, or they joined one of the political clubs at school. Both of those things were obviously had strong social motivations. You got to hang out with other people, and it was fun, right? Both of them were found to be fun. I tended to go to the demonstrations and protests. I never identified with the partisan crowd, but I noticed that the people who did it loved it, and many of them went on to be very engaged in public affairs. So, political parties. Okay. In fact, I thought the people who went the other route from myself, who went into the political clubs at school and remained engaged with the campaigns and the parties, might have even changed parties once or twice, that was very constructive. They weren't criticizing, they were often, really trying to contribute, and seemed very effective in helping them build their networks and their careers. Also, political parties have machinery and resources applied to those parties and to those clubs and to recruiting youth. So why no mention of political parties here? Was it a decision, or and if so, why?
I can take that. Okay. Well, thank you for that question. So our research actually found that youth right now they're not really joining political parties at the rates that they used to. And this is because a lot of youth engagement is shifting from before, when it was largely ideological, to being issue focused. Youth, not that they do not care about political parties, they do. They are just less focused on individual parties and joining political party organizations, and more so on who cares about the things that I care about, the issue I care about, and less so what political party and having political party affiliation, which is why we decided not to go that route in terms of focusing on political parties, although we do acknowledge there is a whole machinery that political parties have for engaging.
All right. Would you like to go next, Kyle, and then we'll...
Sorry. Sorry, just as yeah, and as well, because our challenge asks us to look at trust and civic engagement, we can't forget about the trust aspect of this question. And so if there's a decrease in trust that youth are having towards their democratic institutions, and which would include political parties, it's a little bit of a harder sell to say that you should trust these parties without being demonstrated in sort of systematic or systemic change in terms of how these parties are engaging youth.
Thank you for your. I'm working. Okay. Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. I liked how you started off looking at wide across Canada, or youth generally, I would say, in North America, and honing in onto Vancouver. I'd like to ask you some questions about this lack of trust, because you pointed out there's a lack of trust, but I didn't quite get or hear the main reasons for this lack of trust. And I'll put this for, we just had a government, the Justin Trudeau government, that created a youth council, had a minister for youth, show that it was going to make a commitment to engage youth, and in some ways they did. But right before this election, where we had the Mark Carney government, we saw young Canadians, youth, move towards the Conservatives, and the two issues that they framed that was around housing prices and also the lack of finding good, solid jobs right out of school. So I'm wondering, in your research, what the main policy factors behind this lack of trust? I'm curious to know what you came across, and if it was different in Vancouver as opposed to across the country.
Yeah, so what I'll say just to start, so trust in your institutions is obviously going to be a contextual or sort of cultural component, but what we found in Canada and other sort of Western liberal democracies is that large socioeconomic divides are the number one contributor to a growing lack of trust. And what this reflects ultimately is, as a citizen, you are perceiving or sort of assessing your institutions as no longer being responsive to your needs and concerns. And so this really hits at that sort of institutional ineffective institution component, because a driver of trust is when institutions are able to serve their citizens in a way that they feel is fair, non-discriminatory, and responds to their needs. And so when you have these large socioeconomic divides, this contributes to the feeling that my institutions are not responsive or reflective of my needs. Therefore, I decrease trust. And these trends were common across Canada. Obviously, in Vancouver, I imagine the housing is particularly pronounced, but reflective of a general sentiment of North American and Canadian youth.
Yeah, sure. And to jump into that as well, actually, more broadly speaking, what we're seeing in Canada was actually reflected worldwide and over history as well. Our research from the U.S. Pew Center actually showed levels of trust in the United States based on administration. And what we actually saw was during socioeconomic crises, so for example, 2001, 2008, that's when you would see dips or highs in trust. During the Reagan years, you had high trust because the economy was good. Then it dipped a little bit and it started to go back up again during the Bush years. But more broadly speaking and more recently, COVID-19 definitely shifted levels of trust, and we saw this across the world and in society. Actually, I'm sorry, I have to grab the number, but because I want to be accurate here, and this is good work from Ipsos polling, but actually, pardon me here, but basically, during COVID-19, we saw BLM protests, which are typically associated with the political left. And then we also saw the Freedom Convoy and the Trucker Convoy anti-COVID sentiments, which was typically associated from the right. However, research from Ipsos showed that youth, while they weren't supporting it directly, they shared the sentiments and they acknowledged that they were sharing those sentiments with both the left and the right, which goes back to what Diana said before about how youth now, it's not really about political parties or where you land ideologically, but it's about the issues. And it goes back to as well what you said about it's about housing and securing a job afterwards. So this really just emphasizes how youth now are changing in how they're engaging, and what matters to them is the issues and not necessarily about ideology.
That was a fantastic presentation. I know a little bit about this, that's for sure. Because we introduced civics education in my government when I was Minister of Education. And so I was delighted to hear you guys talking about that. I think the thing about this last election is there was the element of trust on both ends of the age spectrum. So young guys, men especially, but young people were voting for right-wing parties that were offering real dramatic changes, and older people were voting for Mark Carney, who was offering stability and change, but all of it carefully managed and thought through. So I would argue that change and the appetite for change, or the appetite for something ideological, exists at both ends of the spectrum, and it was uniquely kind of bifurcated in this election. So what I really liked about it was that you were talking about people being engaged at the municipal level. That's super important, because it's really easy for young people to get involved there and then to see themselves in the outcomes of those decisions. So I thought that was a really strong part of what you were talking about. And then the civics education as well was really important. I do think that further to your point, governments need to harness the power of the protests, because I think protesters are active. They are civically engaged. And I think that's part of the challenge for us. So I guess my question would be for you around it's a very big question that everybody's grappling with. It's been online activity that has been really determinative about young people's attachment to governments. And that online activity has been, in most cases around the world, heavily influenced by hostile foreign actors who profoundly hope to undermine our democracy because they don't believe in democracy. Guys like Donald Trump. So what is your antidote for that as young people? Because it seems I don't have an answer to that, and I don't think government has an answer for that. And if government did have an answer for that, it would be probably a terrible one that would fail. So what's your answer?
So, thank you so much. In the process of scoping our project, as we mentioned before, this is huge. Trust and civic engagement spans so many different topics, and obviously misinformation is on people's radars right now. And so we think that obviously misinformation and supporting, not supporting misinformation, deterring it to support democratic values is important, but it requires a broader set of policy initiatives. And so while I can't offer you a particular prescribed approach right now, what I do think is important is that we need to be looking at other sort of avenues through which we can regulate and monitor our digital spaces. Because ultimately, this is a question of how we do that effectively. And so civic engagement for youth offers an opportunity for them to be informed in a very particular way and have their opinions heard, but it does lie a little bit outside the scope of what we can do personally as government. Well, I'm not government. You as government.
I'm not either.
You're ex-government. I think that's...
One of the observations you made at the beginning was that young people are attracted increasingly to autocratic forms of government.
Yes.
Yes.
Can I jump in? Yeah, okay. So one of the main motivations for looking at trust was this fear of democratic backsliding, which we're seeing an uptick with youth. So things like Donald Trump rhetoric is more appealing, mainly because it really appeals to exactly what you said, this idea of change that youth really want desperately, especially because of things like economic crisis, not being able to afford a house ever in your lifetime, unless the next group has solutions for us. But what we found in our research, was that if you engage youth first at a local level, like you said, municipally, so that they can see that if they engage with government, there is a response, it builds trust upwards. So we also found that if there is trust within municipal governments, then you're going to see a ripple effect to trust towards the federal government. And this trust is key to actually fighting and combating some of that democratic backsliding we're seeing. And so really we're putting forth this idea that if you actually just engage youth, listen to them, and harness some of that protest energy, but also what we talked about in terms of youth empowerment, like the ways they're actually engaging in informal channels, then you're able to actually build trust to safeguard democracies like Canada's against this appeal of like autocracy.
Great. Okay. Jameson's here.
I am. Hi.
From the Metcalf Foundation. Very nice to see you and welcome.
Thank you.
Metcalf was the sponsor for this project. We'd love to give you the floor to ask a question, make comments. And we send a microphone.
I think I got one. I'm not sure. Is it working? Yep. Yeah, thank you. So Jameson Stevie from the Metcalf Foundation. I taught here for 2 years, so it's nice to be back. A couple comments off the top. First of all, I'm sorry for such a broad research question, but I regret nothing. The overall brief on this one was basically help fix civic engagement, pick your population, pick your jurisdiction, not sure if it's municipal, provincial, federal. And so hopefully that's still a way to approach it, but I was really impressed with what you guys did. Often when I see students present, they're very good at problem identification. Premier Clark can probably appreciate this. Really good at problem identification, really good at jurisdictional analysis. And then the recommendation section is ... Good luck in political life. And so the fact that you have an implementation plan and an actual budget puts you ahead of much of the public service across the country. So congratulations. I really appreciate the work that you did. I guess my question would be, when you had that broad scope, why did you choose this particular cohort as the way to move the dial? Because as we talked about as we were preparing for this, I can hear some baby boomers angry that we have chosen a group of people who, why is your voice more special than anyone else's from a civic engagement perspective?
Sorry, we're just trying to determine because we broke up the possible question subjects. So I think this falls under my jurisdiction. So to rephrase if I'm understanding correctly, if I had to couch it in really maybe not accurate language, but why should youth matter more? And what we're saying is not necessarily that youth should matter more. It's just that what the data shows is that so far they are the most underserved population by their democracies. And so it is not to say that engaging adults who actually already engage in the sort of key indicators or key areas that government cares about, such as voting, to use your language, the baby boomers, or actually how we have technically defined them in our report is the young at heart. And so those who so the young at heart actually already vote the most. And so if our problem is that youth are not demonstrating support for these kinds of systems, it identifies a clear group that needs to be further served. So we would also sort of encourage, in our scoping as well, we talked about this, how to sort of foster intergenerational collaboration, as because there's this widening generational divide in terms of support for these systems, adults do play a very key role in building civic engagement habits and forming civic networks that allow youth to be informed. So there is a place for the young at heart, and we really value you. We just want to raise the position of youth so that they feel, as you can see on the slide, engaged, informed, and empowered to be able to action their civic knowledge.
Okay, we're going to open it up. I just have a mini question. Despite being told by my teenagers because of my technological prowess that I am a boomer, I am not a boomer. I'm Gen X. So if they're young at heart, we must be young, right? Yes.
I mean, I think that tracks.
Yeah, we're not just young at heart. Gen X is still young, right? Questions from the floor. Gabe, I see lots of hands. Yeah,
Awesome.
Pumaya, go ahead.
This was an awesome presentation. I think Kyle pointed at something which resonates with me in my experience as a young person engaging in a political party, which is that there are a lot of selection. There's a lot of selection bias in who gets involved, and there are rewards for being involved as a young person if you're attending a post-secondary institution, if you have the time because you're not working 2 jobs, if you live in a major city so you have access to these resources and opportunities, then it puts you on a path to maybe being a staffer someday. How have you thought to ensure that you're not only deepening engagement for those young people who through whatever number of privileges have already been able to be involved, but also broadening the number and the types of youth who are engaged?
Okay, I guess this is my jurisdiction. So I'm going to take the broadening one first. So one of the things that we were really concerned about is when we think about youth civic engagement, when we were looking at the programs that exist in Canada for youth to actually engage, it's a lot of the same people that actually actually are interested in those programs. A lot of youth civic engagement programs are targeted at youth leadership. And so it's the exact same people. And this is concerning because there are a lot of disparities when we think about civic engagement with youth. So racialized youth, queer youth, they engage a lot less than all of the ones that you said have privilege. And so why we went with the program package that we did is we really wanted to make sure that we had multiple off-ramps for youth to get engaged. So if you want to get engaged, you can get engaged doing the civic education projects, or you can get engaged using your youth hubs, where the micro grants are, it's like small micro grants for they're around $50 to $500 to action really local initiatives. So you want to plant a community garden, you want to have a block barbecue that can bring people together, you can do that. So we really wanted to make sure that we were including programming that will allow for different levels and entry points into engagement. So that's the broadening. In terms of the deepening, this is why we have other things like assemblies where folks who probably are a lot more interested, although it is random, but folks who probably are a lot more interested and already engaged will be more interested in engaging in those kind of ways, like kind of direct channels to be thinking through some policy, as well as there will be opportunities. I'm thinking of Julia's youth design grants when we were thinking about having youth impact assessments. If municipalities are receiving funding to kind of do these programs that are youth design focused, they can then actually have money, because one of the key problems with municipalities is a lack of resources. They'll have money to engage with those youth that are already keen to continue this kind of engagement. So you can be more than just a political staffer, you can actually help affect change.
Pumaya, Isabella, Elijah, Anil. Okay. Pumaya first.
Thank you very much. Great presentation and great recommendation.
Okay.
I think you've explained really well how you want to go about implementing all the programs, but I assume the government might have challenges choosing which one to prioritize. In case they cannot do all of them at the same time, how would you suggest they go about prioritizing? Thank you.
Okay, stepping forward because this is my jurisdiction. Thankfully, we prepared a little bit. This is part of our annex slide, but actually, in our report, we created, sorry, it's at the back so you get to see everything here. But essentially, we created an implementation criteria based on 4 variables, the first being risks to government, the second being impact on youth, and then the last 2 is cost and the time to implement. The latter 2 are a bit explanatory, whereas the first 2 are a bit more holistic. So we also did a risk assessment, which is in a report which you should read July 7th, it comes out. But risk to government is essentially the chances of any of the initiatives having consequences that we identified in our risk assessment. So that is what we term risk to government. Impact on youth is a bit more holistic in the sense that we define this as how much we expect youth engagement to increase by. So this is what we have here as our implementation criteria. And because risk to government and impact on youth is a bit more hard to quantify, we also developed an impact assessment where you can sort of, based on how you do, I don't know if you risk it as low, high, medium, you can use this matrix to figure out, depending on how do I put this, how willing your mandate is, or your government is willing to engage youth. You can use this matrix. So if you want to stay in the middle, maybe stick with 3.1 and stick with the microgrants and the youth hubs. If you want to be really safe, stick to participatory budgeting because it's low risk to government but high impact on youth. So yeah, we created this implementation criteria to sort of help ground our initiatives because we recognize that Why Engage is a very, very big package, and it costs $12 times a million. So we recognize that not all the government perhaps might not want to implement all of them, but we really do want them to implement at least one, and we have an implementation criteria that they can use to help them figure that out. So, yeah.
Great. Isabella at the back. And then I think I lost track. Anil. Yeah. Elijah. Bianca. Okay. And then let's try those 3 and see where we are then.
Okay. Hi. First of all, thank you for that presentation. It was very engaging, pun intended. I had a question on the why focus phase, because we had something very similar in the Colombian government from 2024 to 2018. And I remember that the government faced a very important challenge that was dealing with the fact that young people wanted to engage, but at the same time, there was like this lack of experience. That makes sense. I mean, even though you might have a lot of ideas and stuff, like you're still just starting your career, you have a lot of things to learn. So what ended up happening is that the government just checked a box and was like, you know what, let's create a playground for the youth, like kind of model UN, but for government. And even though it was something that kind of aligned with the original idea, didn't actually solve the problem because no one wanted to do that. So I'm just curious if you have thought in your implementation considerations how to make the government actually take the time to think about engagement in a way that's actually including the youth in the places of decision making, and not only just, you know, in these parallel figures that are often created for playing a little bit to be government.
Yeah. So one of the key things that you'll notice in Why Focus is the absence of recommendations for youth advisory councils or youth parliaments. And this is because in our research, what we found is that the input that youth provide must be connected to tangible changes or be reflected somehow in the outcome. And so to your question, yes, where are they in the decision making? This is why we not only have, so for the youth assemblies, what we found is that it's very key that government respond in a meaningful way to demonstrate that the recommendations they provided actually have an influence on governance. And so pairing this with the youth design grants, what this does is really allows or enables youth to be key influence or decision makers. Could you actually just repeat your question? I'm so sorry.
It was how to create Colombian example.
Okay, yeah.
I think you got it, as opposed to why not a youth parliament.
Yes, you're so right.
Yeah.
Create incentives for the government to take this, like the need for actually incorporating these in actual places of decision making.
Okay, yes, thank you. I'm so sorry. So I think what this requires, so structurally the youth assemblies do achieve this, is that it will require a response from government. The youth-centered design grants really allow for youth to be part and design the decision-making process at the local level. In terms of incentives, well, for the design grants, these are voluntary, and so, you know, there's obviously issues with that in terms of what municipalities will sort of, you know, take this up. But I think the main incentive is that there's sort of public pressure, right? And sort of launching these initiatives, you've made a commitment to focus and prioritize youth. And so then to not follow up on that not only deteriorates the trust that youth already have, but it sort of creates a, you know, it sets a bad precedent for how your government plans on engaging youth. So the incentive really is that it is kind of, it is not politically positive to not follow up on these. I think that would be our incentive.
Yeah.
Can I add one more thing?
Yes, go ahead.
Julia worked really hard on this, and I just wanted to not forget this. So with the youth-centered design grants, one of the things it's money that will be given to municipalities. So we really try to focus on, like, how can we get youth to engage at that really local level, because it's the closest level to community, so it has it's more likely to have a bigger impact on them. And the money, one of the things it does, it's capacity building. So it's trying to get at some of that change that you're talking about. So how do we restructure the culture within government, especially at that local level? And so we know that things don't get done usually if there isn't money put to them. So we're giving you money to help with these structural concerns when it comes to governance, which there is precedent for this. The BC government has restructuring grants that help municipal governments actually think about governance at a more like in-depth level that they usually have capacity for.
Okay, and Neil, yeah. You got a microphone there?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for that awesome presentation. I think I see a lot of European influence on there. I think I see influences of the cadet model as well. I care about partnerships and I care about integration. And so when you guys were sort of doing your research, did you think about how that plays out when you engage the youth in terms of integrating them into the Canadian identity? And then the second part of this is we have a specific challenge going on in the university colleges sector. We're in a university, so I'm not going to focus on that. Did you think about the role that colleges could play in this whole equation from a partnership and integration perspective?
Well, yeah. We have, for example, for the youth lead, is going to be implemented in partnership with civil society organizations and municipalities, but implemented by the government of BC. But besides that, this partnership is going to extend to using or upgrading libraries and community places that youth are already engaging, to turn them into youth hubs that would be suitable for young people to engage in a confident and bold way. I hope I've answered.
Could you repeat your second part of your question?
The role of colleges?
So post-secondary, because you did talk about civic education, but I think...
And maybe I'll also very quickly add, I think recently the UN changed its definition for youth from 30 to 35, which I was really happy about. And in Canada, I think we see it around 30 to 32 on different grant application documents. And that is why I feel like the conversation about colleges is important, because they're getting a lot of exposure. And that's also a sector that's going through a lot of trouble right now.
Yeah, so to answer your question about what is the role, I think to put it more broadly, academic institutions, this was actually highlighted in our interest holder interviews, who really stressed that they do play a vital role in developing research and doing policy experimentation with and for youth. And so what we noticed is that Canada across the board has a pretty, like a data deficit in terms of how are youth engaging, in terms of also more broadly our civil society sector, which does play a vital partnership role in being able to design and deliver our policy package. And so what academic institutions can do is collect information, and obviously this would require some sort of coordinated data approach that we did not explore, but really, in terms of providing research, policy experimentation, and data collection, we see that as a vital role, contribution that academic institutions can make to this space.
Thank you.
Okay.
One more thing.
Oh,
sorry.
Quick.
A good example of this, just for your own knowledge, is in the University of Waterloo, Laura and Christopher. They actually Western, sorry, thank you. They actually just conducted, sponsored by the Maxwell Foundation, a Canada-wide assessment of youth engagement across the country to see how youth are actually engaging. So this idea of data is really important, and academia definitely has a huge role to play.
Okay, I'm going to have to draw it to a close with the two last questions. I have one person online, and then I had Elijah who was waiting. So if you two can both ask your questions, and we'll give it back to the team. So the online question, are you going to read it out?
So Wayesa is one of our incoming MPPs. She asked, did your research explore the role of social media in shaping civic trust? What strategies might help strengthen trust in that space?
Okay, so carrying on the trend of implementation, I was just wondering how you guys thought about the various ways the different initiatives would be housed within the actual government of BC.
I'll start with the most recent one. Again, for implementation, not in the criteria, but going through all the initiatives, the quick one, all of Why Learn, that one evidently is going to be with the Ministry of Education. Why Lead, the youth hubs, we see that one being under Ministry of Municipal Affairs, given the similarity of the community gaming grants and the initiatives that they already fund. As well, for the Youth Center Design Grants, that is also going to be Ministry of Municipal Affairs. As for the web portal that is under Y Focus, that one will be housed in the Ministry of Citizens Services, because that is where the Chief Information Officer is. And actually, in a recent report, the average project for them cost $2.2 million. Our projected estimates for our portal was $1 million up front. So again, democracy at a cost, but and then the youth assemblies, that one is a bit more special because we want that one to be housed in the Premier's office, because we feel that that would be a way to really signify to the youth that they want to be heard. You can think of this as akin to Justin Trudeau assigning himself to be the Minister of Youth and creating the Youth Advisory Council. So that's where we see all of those initiatives being housed in the government.
And just a small question about the role of social media in engagement and trust.
Yeah, small question, no doubt. Sorry. We definitely have explored what is the role of social media, and this really takes us back to the scoping phase in terms of defining what is the objects of our trust and what is the sort of venues in which we are going to be doing our civic engagement. As I had mentioned earlier, the whole issue of mis and disinformation, I think, requires a broader policy approach that focuses on how we regulate and control, or control is a bit of a negative word, but regulate and maintain public online spaces that are full of accurate information that are able to support our democratic system. So social media is very much a vital part of this, and youth do participate I think larger compared to other age cohorts in social media, but requires a broader policy package, as we really want to focus on the mechanisms that will enable them to engage, learn about civic engagement opportunities, and then action this knowledge.
Okay. Thank you so much, team. Seth, Diana, Nickson, Julia, congratulations and fantastic work. We will take a short break, and we will come back for our last presentation at 2:15. See you all very soon. Thank you, Christy, for standing in as our judge on our judging panel.
Thank